Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation on reimagining humanitarian assistance. I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI, and I was thinking that probably wasn't a more timely moment to have this discussion. I mean, even before Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis were testing the humanitarian system to the limit. A humanitarian system that is not particularly fit for purpose and really needs reimagining, which is the point of the conversation today. But now with Ukraine, we can just imagine what the spillover of the crisis is going to produce. At ODI, we're calling in the triple shock in terms of the impact that it's going to have on the economy, on energy, and on food security. And just in terms of food security, there is a massive looming crisis in the food security crisis in the Horn of Africa that will mean that millions of people will be in need of humanitarian assistance, and we'll touch on that in the conversation. But we all know the causes of enduring humanitarian needs. It's protracted conflicts that go on, for years on end that don't find resolutions. Obviously, there is the impact of, climatic crises that are only getting worse, and poor levels of adaptation, and the list goes on. But there is also another dimension that is the system, an outmoded system that really struggles to renew itself. We've seen a lot of efforts to try and reform the system, but at best they tinker at the edges. They don't really succeed in transforming the systems more deeply, which is what it really requires. At ODI, we've been assessing the progress in reforming the system since 2016 in the latest humanitarian reform agenda, that is the Grand Bargain. We evaluate the Grand Bargain every year formally. And yes, there has been some progress. We need to sort of also acknowledge the achievements. For instance, in the uptake in terms of cash modalities, we've seen an element of progress, but we're really fundamentally struggling in one of the strongest propositions that the World Humanitarian Summit made, which was to support more local action. That we're just not achieving. And on Monday, the humanitarian agenda here at the annual meeting opened with a discussion on Ukraine. And I thought it was really powerful hearing Ukrainian colleagues, and maybe we'll hear more of that, being really frustrated in terms of not feeling that the international humanitarian system was not supporting their own efforts more deeply. It was bypassing, or in some cases even ignoring what they're doing. And it left me with the question that if we're not going to support local action in Ukraine, when are we ever going to do it? Because we have a country with incredibly strong capabilities, and still the response is to default to business as usual. So to discuss all of this, we've got a great panel here today. To my left is David Beasley, who is the Executive Director of the UN World Food Programme. Next to David, we've got Evgenia Bodina, who is the Curator of the Kyiv Hub. And last but not least, Per Hegenes, who is the CEO of the IKEA Foundation. Before we get started, just encouraging all of you, both here in the audience and online, to amplify the conversation on social media. The hashtag is WEF22. Make sure that the best insights, the best provocations, the best reflections are shared beyond this room, please. Evgenia, I want to start with you. At the start of the crisis, you had this idea of actually creating this hub with other global shapers and try and crowd the best information about the needs that exist in Ukraine, and crowd in response from 40 different countries. Can you tell us a little bit about what the needs are and what you've been able to do and what you're hoping to continue to do?
Thank you for your question. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. So maybe I would start from the needs, because the needs are really different depending on the territory where you located. Because Ukraine is a huge country, and we have basically the air alarm going to the whole country, right? And but the most affected regions are eastern and south of Ukraine, also helpfully liberated the part of Kyiv Oblast recently. So I would say definitely a humanitarian crisis in the east and south of Ukraine, especially on the territories that are now currently occupied by the Russian army, are more severe, right? People are suffering from food supply chain. People are suffering from medicine, the crucial medicines that might be lead to deaths of people from different ages. So these are the most urgent needs maybe that should be thinking of in the east and south part of Ukraine. At the same time, Ukrainians are facing in the middle and the western part of Ukraine another humanitarian needs, such as housing, temporary housing, because we have a huge social infrastructure to be destroyed by bombing of Russian missiles in the whole territory of Ukraine, and we have 8 million people displaced right now over Ukraine, with 6 million coming to Europe abroad, right? So we have a huge crisis and internal displaced people here in Ukraine. I would say maybe a few words as well on legal aid, because people who are moving to safer zones to Ukraine are really often need to have a legal assistant with their documentation, because the documentation might be lost or burned in houses. So that's actually something crucial that is not raised by the humanitarian actors such publicly on international community. Still, we have a lot of actors, volunteers, legal aid institutions working on that. Me specifically, I was working in Danish Refugee Council for 2 years since 2014, working with internally displaced people, basically on legal assistance, and we had a huge flow of people needed it during the 8 months of the war. And it's actually also important to know that the war in Ukraine hasn't started 3 months ago. It started 8 years ago. In 2014, we have an occupation of Crimea and annexation of Crimea and occupation of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And humanitarian actors was there already for all those 8 years, establishing a network and connections and cooperation with the government, with the local communities. But at the same time, when we come to the events of the February 24th, international actors was not that active. That actually was hopeless in a sense, because they were, for obvious reasons, caring about their own stuff to be safe, right? Because you have a protection, you have a special system for security, so you need to evacuate your stuff, which is, understandable. So I think it's really important to note here the heroics that Ukrainians are doing right now on the ground, on the local communities, because from the first day, basically from the first second, I don't know any single person who is not participating either in a fundraising activity or delivering humanitarian aid or delivering military equipment to the army and volunteers or supplying helping pets. You know, the crisis and the war revealed such a huge links and such a huge number of humanitarian needs, not only for not for Ukrainians as personalities, right, but also for animals in the zoos, right? We don't think about it at the beginning, but then it turns out to be a huge way to need helping. So I think Ukrainians, and it's really important, this is the reason why it's important to support locals in their humanitarian assistance, is because they're risking their lives, they're ready to go to the hotlines, they're ready to go to the fire, right, to save and provide assistance to people, to their relatives. So we built a huge network among local initiatives, and also not only initiatives, just people, right? People whom you might know, how we can help here. And I think that's the most essential that was there in the place since the first day of war.
Thanks, Evgenia. I think you explained very clearly how strong the local response is. I want to come to David and Per, and perhaps you can also reflect on this afterwards. What we're seeing is clearly very strong local engagement, local action, but also a direct outpouring of support from the public, particularly in Europe, perhaps in North America, and of course the private sector there is also contributing. So how do you think this will influence, for better or worse, the wider humanitarian system, or is still going to be business as usual?
I'll repeat that question. I want to make sure I got it.
So this direct support of the public, to Ukraine, Evgenia is talking about both how locally they are operating, but we've also seen a lot of aid being sent directly. Not always the best modality, but there is this urge to help more directly. Is that going to change the way we normally respond to crisis?
No, not really. I mean, 80% of our operations now in war zones. We're the world's largest humanitarian organization. We feed about 130 million people in a given day or week before Ukraine. And what has been quite remarkable, though, is the outpouring of support that's been taking place. When you get the visuals of women standing in lines all night long at the borders, with their children and their husbands on the front lines, and there's not only men on the front lines too. We know that's men and women, and so the outpouring of support on the border areas took a lot of pressure off of us to be able to zero in on the besieged areas in the east, because the east is all about commodities because there's no supply chain. But everything west of the east line of the besieged cities is you still have some operational supply chain systems, not necessarily for furniture, but at least for some degree of food. So what we're trying to do is get liquidity into the marketplace, because you've got a cash crisis inside Ukraine. So like we're reaching about 4 million people inside Ukraine. As of today, we're reaching on cash-based transfers about 900,000, which is like $75 per person, depending on the household size. And next week we'll reach about 1.2 million, et cetera, et cetera. But the biggest issue inside is the port and being able to move supplies, because this is having an extraordinary global impact on the entire world, not just what's on inside Ukraine. And so the systems are stretched right now, because just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, we had Afghanistan. Well, we had Ethiopia, then we had Afghanistan. You had COVID all within that. And so the numbers of people starving to death around the world is just going up, up, up. But we'll hopefully get more of that a little bit later. But Ukraine, the complexity of moving food outside of Ukraine is compounded because of the rail system, and you don't have the number of trucks you need, and how the infrastructure, and I don't think we have time to get into that today, but I've been so amazed, though, of the leadership in Ukraine, and this young leadership. Oh my gosh, they've been remarkable to work with. They're so full of energy, so full of ideas, and so full of hope.
You pointed to some important complementarity between the system and the local response. I'll be coming back to you, Evgenia, to get your reflections, whether you think we're getting the balance right. But Per, do you think the current level of response we're seeing may change the system?
Well, what is going to change the system is the big question. I think what it has done is to put a focus on what it's like to be a refugee. And the media has focused so much on that. So in that context, it's going to have changed a number of people's understanding, how desperate a situation it is to be a refugee, to leave everything behind, be forced to flee with your closest belongings and nothing else, and forced to start a new life. I think this is something that we don't hear so much about. Some of us who work in this context in Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, we know what it's like to be a refugee. We think we do, at least. But now I think more people in Europe have a different perspective on what it actually means to be forced to flee. Now, what is that going to do to the system? Well, the two things that concerns me, really, and I went to the border just after the war started together with the CEO of IKEA to better understand what it is that we could do that would be helpful for the refugees and for the local communities, instead of thinking about it ourselves. And we learned a lot, and we were, of course, extremely impressed by the outpouring of support, the way the Polish people, the Moldavian people embraced the refugees, did everything they could to help, and the governments then actually providing all the services, all the freedoms, the freedom of movement, the right to work, the basic support for basic goods, everything that people need and they should have and that we should take for granted. But it's not taken for granted. That's not the way it normally happens. And so the two concerns I have is, one is we're still not doing in European countries, we're not giving that to refugees who are not coming from Ukraine, but refugees who are from Sub-Saharan Africa or Asia are not receiving the same kind of support. They've become a different class. That concerns me a lot. And these refugees are also present in the countries that are now embracing the Ukrainian refugees. That's nothing to say that it shouldn't be happening the way it's happening with Ukrainian refugees, but we're sort of creating two different classes, and that concerns me. The other concern I have is obviously that funding and focus is driven by media. And now the media is full of focus on what's happening in Ukraine, and that's good for all the reasons I just said. But the focus on Afghanistan, the focus on the war in Ethiopia, in DRC, and so on and so forth, is just going away. It's just disappeared. And we have crises in those countries that are similar to the crisis that we see in Ukraine. We just don't really see it anymore. And I'm concerned that because we don't see it, we don't hear about it, we forget about it, and with us forgetting about it, the funding will go away. And that really concerns me.
I think that's a critical point, and I want to come back to that. But first, Evgeny, let's talk about this complementarity. I'm really interested to hear your view.
Yeah, may I just address a small comment? I would say that something that is Ukraine facing right now is actually lessons learned on how to treat refugees from the previous crisis. But I think the most important point is that actually what steps should the whole global community do to make this lessons learned implemented in the future for the other crises that will be, or hopefully not, but the world might face. And that's actually Ukraine showing, and Europe and the whole world shows that such a huge solidarity to learn from, because Ukrainian crisis shows that humanitarian systems started to be from the organization to the government, or organization to the organization, basically taking an approach from human to human, because I'm myself as well internally displaced, firstly from Donetsk to Kiev in 2014, and now from Kiev to Berlin. I personally face this refugee trip, as you said, and it's actually, I had just one backpack packed 1 week before, mostly suited for the basement rather than for living in Berlin and doing job, right, and meeting people like from the partners organizations. So that's I have this experience of refugees, and people to whom I talk, who open their doors, they are now know how I'm facing. So basically, those are lessons learned for European society from the whole world, not only Europe, right? How we can treat refugees better by showing what we are feeling and how we can do better.
David, Evgeny makes a very important point about leveraging solidarity. We have some really important crises out there that we're not really hearing about. The Horn of Africa is one that obviously I personally know how difficult the situation is out there. Can you tell us a bit more about what is going on and how we can leverage this moment of solidarity to try and widen attention to other crises?
You know, just when you think it couldn't have gotten any worse, I mean, literally. We were facing a humanitarian crisis before the Ukraine war. We were scaling up. It's hard to believe that 5 years ago, there were 80 million people, what we would call marching to starvation. And right before COVID, that number had jumped up to 135. And the question would be, why did it jump then? And there were two fundamental reasons. One, man-made conflict, and the second was climate shocks. COVID comes along, economic ripple effects around the world, and especially in the poorest of the poor countries. And that number went from 135 to 276 million people. Now within that, this is pre-Ukraine, 49 million of those 276 in 43 countries are knocking on famine's door. We were already, before Ukraine, cutting 8 million beneficiaries down to 50% in Yemen, Chad, Niger, Mali, Ethiopia, Somalia, I can keep going, that we were cutting to 50% rations in nations around the world. Fuel costs were going up astronomically. Food costs before Ukraine were going up astronomically. Shipping costs. We are now looking at an operational expense increase of $71 million per month. That's with Ukraine. Now, with the Ukraine increase in market volatility, you're seeing a nation that normally grows enough food to feed 400 million people, that's off the market. Gone completely. The reason 30% of all wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine together, 20% of the maize, 76% of cooking oil, I mean sunflower oil. And then you got the fertilizer problem. So again, when you think it can't get worse, the breadbasket of the world becomes the longest bread lines in the world. And then when you look at the rest of the world, you've got unprecedented droughts right now, lack of fertilizer for production, which means 50% reduction just in the places that still are operational, fuel costs, and you start adding all that together. This is on top of $26.7 trillion of economic stimulus packages that were passed during COVID. 30% of nations' GDP are stretched. The debt load in Africa is stretched. And so the world is extremely fragile. And now you've got extraordinary market volatility because the port is shut down, and you got to get that port open because 40% of the GDP of Ukraine depends on those ports. You can't get out enough by train and truck the other way. You just can't do it. Now, we're going to be doing all we can to accommodate that as we're working with the leadership in Ukraine. But this crisis, and I tell the Europeans, do not neglect what's south of you and southeast of you while you focus on Ukraine. Because the Sahel, or from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, when you go back and look at the economic indicators and the food pricing index during 2007, 8, and 9, when you had the Arab Spring and all the destabilizing that took place with 48 nations, with political unrest, riots and protests, the factors today are much, much worse. So we've got to address Ukraine, and we've got to address it quickly, firmly, and at the same time, we've got to make certain that we get the support necessary down into the Middle East and to Africa and other places. This is why I've been pounding the pavement, as well as doing massive television to wake up the world how bad this crisis really, really is, because it's a global crisis. So the next 12 months, you're going to have a food pricing problem, but then after that, you'll have a food availability problem around the world. So it's a serious matter. But countries are starting to step up in multiple ways, but there's got to be a lot more done.
You want to come in on this?
Yes, so maybe just a few comments. I really agree and support that actually we need to help Ukraine right now to unblock this food supply, to help the whole globe to prevent the crisis that we are now might face, right? But at the same time, like we are as well as a global shapers that we initiated a support Ukraine now projects, which aimed at showing how foreigners can support Ukraine with different ways, starting from donations to joining social media campaign. So we started receiving a lot of messages at the beginning of war from African countries saying like, why you're not talking, why you're supporting Ukrainians only, why you're not talking about other countries' crises? It's because it's not the first war in the world. And I said, well, we are Ukrainians firstly, of course we are supporting our nations, but you can use our frameworks that we've developed right now to show how and to implement it in your countries, right? Also, I was talking with my amazing manager back into Danish Refugee Council, and he said like, if you want to know how other crises might address it from the legal point of view, look at the Ukrainian government. They've done a fantastic job to implement all needed social legal frameworks, all the law, all social protection, coping with different types of categories of people, vulnerable people, to support them. So basically, you can read what the Ukrainian government is doing right now to see how people can be supported, right? And also, I think it's really important to remember that it's actually the first war that we are watching online right now. We have Starlinks received based in the Azovstal, just watching how people are dying there, having no access to medical supplies, have no access to food in occupied areas, but we have internet to watch it, right? So what should and how the system should be reformed, not just to watch it, but basically save people's life who are protecting right now the whole global security to crash.
Do you want to add something on this? Otherwise, I want to go back to the focus of the session, which is on reimagining humanitarian assistance. And the forum has been doing quite a bit of work on this. And with the Global Future Council on the new agenda on fragility and resilience, we've actually developed some guidelines. We've got three sort of core messages. So the elevator pitch is really supporting local action a lot more, is really facilitating the engagement of the private sector and leveraging digital. And I really want to come back to you, to reflect and sort of then open to the audience. How are we going to do this? I mean, Per, you have like the head of one of the pioneering foundations. They're really trying to support change in the humanitarian system. How can we really make sure that we reimagine humanitarian assistance, and what can philanthropy do?
Well, first of all, what philanthropy do as a general statement is we can take risks. We can go and do early stage development of new models, reimagining the humanitarian assistance, and try it out, and we can be successful or we can fail. And if we fail, we can afford to fail. So that's a good thing about philanthropy. The second thing philanthropy can do is really the de-risking of investments in early stage. What I would say is that there's a lot of good models, there's a lot of good evidence, there's a lot of good experience out there that points towards how the system can be reformed, how the system can be done differently, how support can be provided in a different way, how we can engage people in creating a future for themselves. It's just that we are very siloed in the way we operate. And I think the second point I would make is that the obvious point about collaboration. We talk a lot about collaboration, but how do we actually execute on collaboration? How do we bring all the different partners together? How do we bring the government, the UN, the NGOs, the private sector, and philanthropy together to see what can we achieve better together than what we can achieve individually. And that takes me to the third point, really about the private sector and the fact that most of these situations, these refugee or humanitarian situations, are protracted situations. They go on for years and years and years. And we still have a humanitarian approach to it instead of having a development approach to it. So what we have tried to do as a foundation is look at how can we move from fixing the problem and the immediate crisis and starting to provide dignity back into the lives of the people who have been forced to flee and find themselves in a different country, needing a new start, needing a way to get engaged. How can we take advantage of their skills, their knowledge? How can we combine that with access to finance and create livelihood opportunities that makes use of the skills and their ability to actually engage in providing value into the new country they find themselves. So for me, as a business person originally, it's an obvious thing. We don't want people to sit there idly wait for time to go back, because on average that's going to take more than 20 years, right? How can we find a way where create a win-win situation where you integrate them into the country, give them the dignity back, the opportunity to work, the opportunity to create jobs and livelihood that is sustainable over time. That makes them over time self-reliant. And I think the private sector has a very important role to play, and I don't see as much of engagement with the private sector as I hear talk about engaging the private sector. So the talk about engaging the private sector in most organizations is about how can we get a check. That's the least efficient way to collaborate with the private sector. If you engage the private sector, their network, their experience, their skills, their presence, and their ability to create jobs, you can suddenly transform a community to actually become self-reliant, become productive, become a community that provides positive to society, and then the political problem will slowly go away. So I think that's a huge lost opportunity, and I don't see it happening in the way I would like to see it happen. I'm happy to take even more energy into this and see if I can make it work in certain areas.
I'll come to you again. I just want to ask David, so how do we make this happen? How does the system allow?
When I joined the World Food Program, the United Nations, I mean, one of my first questions is, how do we put the World Food Program out of business? Because you'll never end poverty and hunger through the United Nations or charity. It just is not going to happen. That's good stuff to do good work, but until the private sector is empowered in the countries where they are not able to have success stories, and this is the conversations I'm having with a lot of the private sector CEOs today. You've got to be willing to take higher risks. You've got to be willing to make less profits over a longer period, so you change the systems in the nations such that why is a manufacturing facility or processing major corporation not in that country? I don't need another study for that. Yeah, there's enough studies on that. Go ask a company, why are you not in that country? They'll tell you A, B, C, D, E. Well, go fix those things. Now, in the meantime, yes, we like to get private sector support financially, but I'm less interested in that than I am of their engagement with us, make us more strategic, more effective. So in the countries where we're in 80-something countries, we're the most destabilized and or very fragile countries. How can we get more private sector in there in such ways that we at least stabilize the smallholder farmers and the poorest of the poor? Because when you look at the simple fact that 200 years ago, there was 95% extreme poverty on Earth with 1.1 billion people. We've got now 7.7 some odd billion people and less than 10% extreme poverty. So we've built systems and put institutions and programs in place that's sharing more wealth than any time period in world history. But try telling that to that 10% that's not being reached. So we don't want to tear down the system that's reaching the 90 to reach the 10. Let's make certain that we can improve what needs to be improved, but we've got to fixate and focus on that 10%. And it's going to take the United Nations, it's going to take the governments, the NGOs, and it will not be done without empowering the private sector. And they've got to take this on in a way that's beyond a nice feel-good check. It's got to be engagement and ownership of changing systems in countries. And this is the long-term solution of bringing peace and stability and ending poverty.
Super quick, because I need to open to the audience, and Evgenia wants to come in as well.
Can I just make a comment to the private sector? Because, yeah, we have some great examples of the MasterCards, the Unilevers, the Yaras, the IKEAs that does great work, and in a way that they take a long-term perspective and do what they can to support with their knowledge and their insights and their products. But I think about the private sector more wider than that. I think about the private sector in those countries, because those are the companies who really understand the local community, speak the language, understand the governance structure, can actually drive much quicker development in the local community if we incentivize them. So can we find a way from together with the government, together with finance institution, maybe philanthropy, to leverage and de-risk investments so we can get the local private sector engaged, because that's much easier than having the big international corporations to come in.
Let me add, right, this is critical, what you're talking about.
Let me get Evgenia in, and then I'll come back to you.
No, I mean, it's really crucial point, because I just want to make a point that private sector in Ukraine supports army and humanitarian response from the first day of war, and they are now lack of their money because they need to pay salaries for the people who are now, instead of raising money from their work, they are actually putting all their resources, for example, to feed the army, because I have a lot of, for example, in Kiev, there is a lot of restaurants who are now serving the army just for free for their own resources, right? So we need as well international business, foreign from different countries come, or any other like funding investments come to support the local businesses that are still on the ground, so that are still working with the army, and that is crucial. And also maybe thinking about now they are working on humanitarian response, but we need to think about the development. I totally agree here, and I think that EU has done a great support to Ukrainians, because we are legally not refugees. We have another legal status. We have a temporary protection status that allows us to receive medical treatment in Europe, that allows us to receive social payment, that allows us to work and apply for a work. And here comes reskilling opportunities as well. Here come the private sectors in the countries that are hosting Ukrainians. But at the same time, myself being young person here, right? I want those people to come back to Ukraine to rebuild, right? That's my aim as well, to come back to Ukraine. So here should be a really balanced decision on how both integrate people, for them not to be, to provide temporary status, because for displaced people you need to work on durable solutions, right? But then also to make people come back, because that's something that Ukraine wants. So
excellent point. Can I ask you to hold fire 1 second? I want to ask the audience for their questions, and then you can add the points in the final round. Hiba to the front, lady here, gentleman here.
Hi, Hiba Ali, the CEO
keep it short, please.
Of the New Humanitarian, a news organization that reports about humanitarian crises and the way the world responds to them. I'm not sure that we've really answered the question of the session, which was how to reimagine humanitarian assistance. And we did quite a bit of reporting after COVID, when, again, the narrative was this was a game changer. The way the world responds to crisis was going to be totally different, much more locally oriented, and that didn't happen from what we saw on the ground. Now we're saying the same thing again with Ukraine. So, David, I'd love to hear from you. Was WFP's response different in Ukraine, given the local capacity, than it is in other crises? And then, Per, to your point about development, I'm not sure. I just interviewed 2 Ukrainians this morning, and they said the way, we haven't really talked about this in terms of reimagining, rather than taking a development approach in a case like this, what about taking and the conflict approach? And their point was, if your KPI or your measure of success is how many people do we reach with food assistance, then great, you know, the UN is doing a great job. If your KPI is how do you save lives, which humanitarians claim is their goal, then you should be focusing on ending the conflict. And so to what extent is part of this reimagining more about redefining what humanitarianism is, and it being much more around taking a stance, advocating for a stop to the conflict rather than just handing out rice and tarpaulin?
Great questions. Lady here, if you can pass it. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for a great panel. I am Faraja Nyalandu, a YGL from Tanzania. I work on digital education and system change in digital and education systems. My question is actually echoing what Per was saying earlier on the responses to humanitarian needs around the world, and particularly paying attention to the ratio of philanthropic money that goes to Africa, for example. If you look at the numbers, 5.2% of philanthropic donations from the US, it's only 5.2% that goes to Africa. And the numbers are the same across the spectrum in Europe and just generally. We have less than 10% of philanthropic donations and support coming to Africa. And this session was about reimagining humanitarian assistance. So I'm going back to your initial point of how equitable is this system? How can we rebuild it now that we have good models of solidarity, of lesson sharing, good models of mobilization within the country? How can we have better mobilization at a global level to ensure support for African crises as well? Thank you.
Excellent. Gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Carlos Eduardo Vargas from Caracas, Venezuela. We work in a social innovation community with a focus on youth in Caracas, in Venezuela and in Latam, but also I'm part of the Global Shapers community from the Caracas hub. Very moved and touched for the whole panel, especially for Ivinia and what is happening in Ukraine and the sad similarities that have with the conflict that we have been living also in Venezuela since the last 7 years. We, as an organization and also in the hub, work between the intersection of humanitarian assistance and topics like gender-based violence, climate change, and also high-risk vulnerable communities. And we've seen also working with the Global Shapers in the Project Shaper for Venezuela across the region that there is, when it comes to local activities and local supporting local initiative, sometimes a lack of skills in terms of how to address properly in such a rapid response what is happening in the ground. So there's this concept that it talks about humanitarian innovation, which is part of what my question is about, and it is how can organizations do new strategies in order to address more properly and effective the problems that humanitarian aid faces, and also how to create institutional building while assisting those who need it the most. Thank you.
Thank you. And gentlemen.
I expected the session to really say the problems we got.
Can you introduce yourself, sir?
Sorry, Peter Holmes Accord, the Australian Financial Review. I expected the conversation to be the problems we have got are so substantial we have to really fundamentally change the system because all the indicators are going in the wrong direction. More people to feed, more people to look after, more conflict, higher costs, less food, and we've got to fundamentally change the system. And I was looking for just a couple of those suggestions of what might fundamentally change the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me come back to the panel. Clearly, we want to think of how we change the system, what we can really practically do. We've been talking about this for a long time, but it is really urgent. I said at the beginning, the system is not fit for purpose. We're clearly hearing also from the audience this appetite to see us operate very differently, and Ukraine really has to give us the inspiration to change because we have such great local capacity. A number of questions were directed to you.
I mean, you can use Ukraine as inspiration, but it should have been happening way before then. When I arrived 5 years ago, I asked this question, okay, organizations, UN, you've been in this country 30 or 40 years. Maybe it's not working. Maybe you need to step back and say, what do I need to do differently to put us out of business? In my opinion, the UN shunned the private sector, other than money, money, money. But you've seen, in my opinion, the last 5 years, a complete reawakening that we're not going to solve these problems without the private sector being strategic. I know yesterday, talking with Christian and Patricia, I said about reimagining the humanitarian sphere. And we don't have enough time in the few minutes we have to get into the depth. But the old silos that created development and humanitarian 50 years ago, that doesn't work anymore. It's easy for a humanitarian disaster when you've got a major cyclone or earthquake or tornado or short-term shock from a tribal conflict. But we've got protracted conflict and destabilization now where you need to take, this is why we began packaging the phrase humanitarian development peace nexus, because in Europe and the United States, their systems so rigid, and you've got to break down these barriers so that the humanitarian development funding comes together as more strategic so that we can accomplish objectives for the country and hold the leaders in those countries accountable as well, which is absolutely critical. I could delve into this all day long because I really get upset about it, because when I see this mindset in bureaucracy sometimes that, oh, no, you can't talk to the development people. Oh, no, you can't talk to the humanitarian. I'm like, you know, I can guarantee you the president of your country and the beneficiary out there doesn't give a you-know-what, whether it's a development dollar or humanitarian dollar. How does that dollar get used more strategically to bring hope and self-sufficiency, sustainability, and resilience? And I can give you example after example where we just bring food versus we come in there with water wells and systems. We'll be out of there in a couple of years. I can give you story after story. That's what we need to scale up versus piecemealing it.
Yeah.
Anyway, don't get me started. Anyway.
But we surely
these are the questions that need to be asked.
But within the challenges of the wider, systemic changes that need to happen, I think each organization can do a hell of a lot more to start supporting local action, more, digital direct action. Evgenia.
Okay, so I would say maybe addressing two of the questions. Firstly, also how it could be changed. Like yesterday, I was a speaker in a panel called Working Together for Peace. And my question is, when the world starts working for peace or for humanitarian response, basically when it's threatened or challenged. We are not thinking about it before. We are not preventing it because we are taking it for granted, right? We are taking the peace for granted. So this might not be happening in Ukraine if the sanctions will be on place in 2014 for annexation of Crimea and occupation of Donbass and Luhansk districts, right? So this might not be happening if we prevent Russia to do that. So right now I think it's a great point to be made from the audience, saying that we basically need to stop the war first to fund less on humanitarian assistance and helping refugees from different countries, also from hunger, right? Also from other supply chains, fuel, from oil. But we need to stop the war. And to stop the war, we need embargo on oil and gas. We need to extend sanctions on Russia and isolate it on economical perspective. So I would say, I will be really clear here. So to put more efforts and less money on humanitarian assistance and start working on development, which is a great point. We really need to stop the war. And as for the tips on how maybe humanitarian assistance could be developed, I would say, I had some numbers. Basically, the international organizations in Ukraine and the UN raised the Ukrainian Humanitarian Fund, which is $44 million right now, USD dollars. And only 13 million comes to local communities and local NGOs working on the ground. But believe me, those are people who actually know what is needed on a place, and they are cheaper. Right now they're doing it for free. So I think this is a great way to build a network with, firstly, local authorities on the ground who know the needs of humanitarian assistance and who know what exactly can be done for people to be saved. With local volunteers and NGOs being maybe more flexible, not having these NGOs legal frameworks, you know, to make a huge applications to donor funding, right? But maybe more flexible from the perspective on transparency and accountability, especially if you need an urgent response on a humanitarian case, right? And I think that digitalization comes really in place here, because we can right now provide legal services online. You can provide medicine services as well online. So we really need to use technologies to think and rechange the system that might be done in the humanitarian perspective.
Nice. We're almost at time, but I think the final most important question is, you know, what Peter was saying, what we've heard also from other colleagues in terms of really changing the model. In 2016, we wrote a report which was, you know, defining the changes as rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and I think there is a frustration, you know, in the room. There is a bit like that. So what can we do to really reimagine humanitarian assistance, redefine humanitarianism?
Yeah, I'd love to be able to answer that question. I've experienced exactly what David was alluding to, what you're alluding to, the sort of compartmentalization that we see in this space, and I think that's what needs to change. I'm a business person, so I don't look at things like that. I look at a group of people who need help in order to take themselves from a crisis to a self-reliance point, and my KPI would be increasing family income, for example. And if I succeeded with the development work that I do with my partners, people will be independent, and that's my goal. I'm not in the saving lives business. I'm in the business of trying to improve people's lives. Now, because I'm not a politician, I don't really know how to change this enormous system, but I think part of the problem is that we talk about humanitarian assistance, we talk about development work, instead of just talking about how can we find different ways of help improving people's lives. And if we do that, the funding will come differently, the thinking from the top will be differently, and it's really driven by funders, let's face it, as the funders are the ones driving the strategy, and therefore the compartmentalization, which I think gets in the way of actually doing the right thing.
Very good. I'm afraid we have to end here. I think we've had these conversations for a number of years. I think it's encouraging in some ways, is, you know, coming from the room and also from the discussions, is we're all deeply frustrated and we're all really eager to finally change a system that is no longer fit for purpose and really reimagine humanitarian assistance. So let's continue to talk and figure out how we can do that at the best of our ability. But thank you very much, David, Evgenia, and Per. Please join me in giving them a